All right, welcome. Happy Monday. Today I have with us on the Monday Morning Data Chat, Ricky Thomas and Paul Dudley. And thank you so much for joining us. Of course, the official post for this event just mentions Ricky because we weren't sure at the time that Paul was going to be able to make it. So he's our special guest as well. So Ricky, tell us a little bit about yourself and about streamkap, and then I'll have you go, Paul.
Yeah, sure. So Ricky Thomas. Background is a mixture of Unix engineering, DevOps, CTO of gaming companies and so on. And just generally been in data for the last, 12, 13 years or so. And streamkap, Paul's probably going to give a better background. I'll just give the basic one, which is we specialize in kind of CDC, ETL streaming pipelines.
Great. Yeah. And I'm a co-founder and CEO at streamkap, and spent most of my career in SaaS businesses, more on the business side of things. And then Ricky's and my journey started at a company. He founded a data company called Avora, which was like an end-to-end data platform, a bit like a Domo, let's say. And then we did a spin out from that company called Gravity Data, a batch ETL company. And I guess our timing was maybe not great on that. We spun it out in 2021, and other batch ETL companies like Fivetran and others raised about $1 billion collectively in 2021. So we were a little behind the curve there. But one of the patterns that we'd seen at both Avora and at Gravity was, more people starting to do streaming, but that it was hard, and basically building with a lot of lower level systems, often Kafka most frequently, but spending months to getting to production data pipelines. And so, we'd had this experience kind of building a good experience for batch ETL, and felt like we could bring that to the streaming world, and that's really what we're focused on at streamkap.
So let me ask this question about streaming, because I've often been curious about this myself, just watching the environment and the adoption of streaming. Why has it taken so long for companies to adopt streaming? I mean, you have things like Google Cloud PubSub, Amazon Kinesis that in principle make the core bus very easy to set up. And yet companies still seem to struggle, and they fall into all these tech debt traps and things. So why is that the case? Why is it just now in 2024, maybe 2025, that we'll just see a lot of wide adoption of these technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think my sense is it's a lot of the, it's the broader architecture that sits around that, right? Like, I think you have very robust technologies for that central sort of message processing piece, and it's everything around it that. I mean, I guess that in itself can be complex in the case of like Kafka to manage, but that is getting easier. And then, it's everything around that really that has been the barrier. So what we've seen is like a lot of our customers use streamkap to get data into Snowflake. And, Snowflake, for example, has made things a lot easier in the past just couple of years, handling streaming data with their launch of Snowpipe streaming and dynamic tables, for example, where it's now cheaper and just as easy to stream data in. And then you've got dynamic tables as an effective way to manage that and get to lower latency. So I think a lot of it is a bit of simplifying the actual kind of core technology, but also it's the architecture that sits around it. I mean, we certainly have run into businesses that have a sort of dominantly streaming architecture, but that's pretty unusual. And so I think it's a lot of like, how do things interface across, the downstream systems that you need to work with that has been maybe one of the big barriers, and is starting to change, and where things are getting easier today, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. I think also it's the databases, right, as Paul was alluding to, because I'm not sure I'll get the dates quite right, but 10 or 12 years ago, you had Spark sort of coming out, and then you had Redshift, and Redshift in itself was an amazing moment where it was amazing in terms of its speed and ability to do joined up queries, but actually none of these were great at just ingesting real-time data. Neither was Spark. It was very, very expensive, very difficult to handle. So I think seeing the databases progress, that it's cheaper to ingest, and that's even happening more so recently with Snowflake. This obviously helps no end in terms of the use cases that comes out of it. But I mean, I was trying to use Snowplow, the event kind of tracker, I think 12 years ago or 10 to 12 years ago. And that was really expensive to then enrich it during the stream, also using AWS. And then, okay, I did all that work getting that real-time data, but I can't actually really use it in real time either. It was very, very difficult to use. So it was very useful data, but you still wanted to slow it down and turn it into batch data anyway, because you just couldn't afford to. So I think it's affordable. Lots more solutions out there that make streaming much more feasible.
Interesting. What, out of curiosity, what tool set were you using to enrich the data 12 years ago?
I can't remember what the AWS tool was called. It was the out of box pipeline that Snowplow are offering. What's it called? Was it called EMR or something? I think.
Right. Yeah, and they still have EMR, but it's like their Hadoop stack basically that also integrates, like Spark is kind of the central feature now, but it's built on HDFS. Okay, yeah. No, that totally makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think
we did it ourselves. We tried doing it ourselves, and I mean, this was quite early, but we were doing it ourselves, and it was problematic, and then we ended up paying Snowplow the management support fee. And so even that point now, they weren't that expensive, but when you start bringing it together, that was just getting the data in and enriched and into a kind of tabular format that we could do something with it, let alone all the other costs that then followed, which was, it was just too much.
Well, the thing with EMR, I mean, I would argue even now it's more of just like a software release than a managed solution. Like, they manage your instances and things for you, but you're still responsible for like a lot of the low level code and such.
Yeah, exactly.
How about things like Flink? Like, I mean, Flink has been around for a bit. It's very powerful. I guess there are some traps you can fall into. For example, you always have to think about, okay, if I set up this window, how much memory is it going to consume? Or are you seeing a lot of Flink adoption? Or are you more seeing other more simplified tools?
So we started off with a managed Kafka and a managed Kafka Debezium type setup. And you can do CDC with that. And then we brought in Flink for the transformation or the processing side only, where it was 9 months ago, and more people are asking for it. And I'd say that last year we were reluctant to touch it. We kept hearing what a nightmare it was to manage. That might be unfair, but we used to hear it from the likes of Decodable and others. They would even say they're pulling their hair out trying to get Flink to do what Flink should do, sort of thing. And so that definitely put us off a little bit. So we started exploring more like Kafka streams and so on. But I think things have progressed, and we have Flink, as I said, for the processing too, and it works fine. It's completely fine, and we've used it a lot for just generally unpacking our nesting. I think we might talk about it today, but the set off, people had to sort of massage their data into a different shape, and Flink has been perfect for that, for example.
Yeah, and I think that broader industry, there seems to be more support for Flink, right? You see, there, I guess it's not done, but like for stream processing, like Confluent's obviously placed a big bet in Flink, and I think you just see other adoption across the industry that there's a lot of support for Flink as becoming the standard in the way that Kafka did before. So I think that's part of our I think part of what we see. I mean, I think when you see it in practice in customers who've used it, they definitely have run into challenges with managing Flink. It is complex to manage, but I think part of our ethos, I guess, is that we're in the business of making this sort of things easier, right, and abstracting away some of that complexity. And so, I think for us, it felt like the right place to place our bet in terms of stream processing.
It's funny too, because from my perspective, one of the things that's maybe slowed down the adoption of stream processing is an over obsession with engineering. And what I mean by that is that whenever you bring in a data engineer, and they always want to build things from scratch and set up open source, and it's a good, like, it's a great, let's go do this and build from scratch. But that means if you have a small team, you're going to run out of resources very quickly. And we've seen that over and over again. And so, they'll do like self-hosted Kafka instead of doing Amazon Kinesis or something like that. Do you think that mentality is changing a bit, or do you still see a lot of resistance to just using managed services for like core underlying infrastructure?
We do see some of that. It's been an interesting pattern of like, we've seen this a couple of times now where we talk to a prospect and, they try out streamkap and, they like what we do, but they say, well, we're going to try and build this ourselves. And, because conceptually it doesn't sound that complicated. And then a couple months later, they come back to us and they say, you know what, actually, we're not in the business of doing this ourselves, right? I think this is a pattern I've seen for a long time, beyond just data streaming. But there's always going to be maybe, this is a somewhat made up number, but let's say 10% of companies that are just like, it's their core ethos that they want to build and manage stuff themselves. And, for those type of companies, if they want to resource things appropriately, that's fine. But I think for most companies, it's a spectrum of like, what's the trade-off that they're losing if they're building it themselves. And I think, whether it's streamkap or other services that are out there now, like there are a lot of good solutions that, I think offer good value on a total cost of ownership versus building it themselves. And one of our customers, they kind of scoped it out and like, all right, well, I'm gonna have to hire 2 data engineers in the Bay Area and spend $400,000 a year to create an equivalent service here. It's like we're a lot cheaper than that for them, right? And so unless there's some like strategic reason why you should own that, that piece of infrastructure, I think in a lot of cases it doesn't really make sense to build it yourself.
I think that's right. But also, you've got going back to your point earlier about, Kafka and stuff has been around a long time, and the whole industry is really built around Kafka and Flink now. Solutions, but you can see what they're doing. They're making themselves Kafka or let's say Flink API compatible. So there is that consolidation. There's lots of Kafka engineers out there, but they're probably all working in enterprise companies, and enterprise has been using Kafka, for a long time. But if you look at now the opportunity for the vendors that have been on batch, or the customers that have been on batch in general, they don't have Kafka trained people at all. So when they think about deploying a cluster, and they do want Kafka, right? Usually, it's not always the case, but they're kind of looking for something that's compatible that they can read off the stream also, not just do CDC, because we open up the cluster and they can, write and read off it as well. They just don't have the skills. And batch, to people like Fivetrans credit, they made batch just simple point and click. You didn't really need to know about ETL. Now you can do it cheaper, and maybe you should, but you didn't have to. And that didn't really exist in streaming. So I just think there's a lack of engineers, there's a lack of appetite. And there's been up until recently, which I think, like I say, us and others are around, there's just been a lack of additional features you need. So yes, you may be able to build a simple pipeline, but are you missing a whole bunch of features around alerting, monitoring, data type support, and God knows what else that comes from trying to build it yourself, basically. So.
I think part of what I've seen happen is people, if you're a founder, either on the engineering side or the business side, you're going to study the most successful tech companies in the world, right? So you're going to read about Google, and maybe were even around for, big data and MapReduce and GFS and HDFS. And so you might tell yourself, oh, well, Google was really, really successful by building everything from scratch. Like they invented all this stuff, and Facebook too, arguably, and the big heavy hitter FANG companies did this. But I think what that misses is that when Google was founded, none of this existed, unless you wanted to like buy what are now really old creaky solutions that were extremely expensive, like Teradata. You had to build it yourself. That was your only option. No one had a solution for like web scale scraping to process data. It did not exist.
Yeah, exactly.
And now it does.
Also, though, as you'll see in data teams, though, is that there's just a lack of accountability on the cost of labor. So it's like, oh, the tool, we want something free and cheap. Like, okay, but you're going to pay 1 or 2 people to build it for 3 months or whatever. Now, that's not always the case. And we're the same. We'd always look at cheap and free first. But I think there's just been a lack of accountability in the last 10 years. The whole modern data stack definitely was a nice movement in itself, but it cost a lot of money. And you paid a lot of engineers stitching tools together. And in the end, some of the dashboards I saw are like, how's that any different to the Tableau dashboard you had before? And that's been unfair because the modern data stack has improved in lots of ways and helped organizations. But if you let sometimes the data team just go and build whatever they want, and they tell the CEO it's going to take 3 months, so they just believe it, because I think a lot of the leadership just didn't understand that there are other options also. So I think building in-house makes a lot of sense for a lot of organizations, but If it is just off the shelf, cheaper, faster, then it's worth taking a look. I think where that changes, of course, is if you have to keep the data more secure, like finance companies, they just got policies and they just can't. It doesn't make sense, maybe, to keep sending data back and forth, from their own cloud to someone else, but also from a security point of view. And as you can see now, we've got the rise of BYOC, so bring your own cloud solutions and so on, to address that. So I think managed services will just deploy more with solutions like BYOC. It's hard to justify at the moment why you should just go and build a whole streaming platform yourself, I think.
Yeah, I mean, on the bring your own cloud has been an interesting evolution. I think just this year, it feels like there's been a big push in that direction, right? Like Confluent announced they're acquiring WarpStream last week, I guess, with the announcement, or maybe the week before. And I think their positioning around that was very much that it was to serve bring your own cloud, which Confluent didn't previously really have an offering for. And Red Panda, I think, has been really successful with their bring your own cloud offering. We've had a lot of demand for it as well. We launched a bring your own cloud offering earlier this year and have had a lot of demand there. So, I mean, part of that, I think, is also like we tend, as Ricky was saying, like, financial services, there's a tendency towards, wanting to have more data residency and security kind of concerns. But, if you're dealing with streaming, I think tends to be higher volume use cases. And so dealing with egress out to a SaaS vendor also doesn't really make as much sense. And so if you can simplify as much as possible how many different environments that your data is going through, that's been, I think, another trend that we're seeing more of.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to rewind real quick just to the general idea of tools that make it simpler to query streams. So we talked about Flink. It used to be pretty hard to manage. It's gotten easier. It's becoming more popular. But like, what do you think happened to KSQL? Because KSQL was kind of framed as, the future way to query Kafka streams in a really simplified fashion. And it's now, let's just say, heavily de-emphasized. Like, what happened there? What went wrong?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we looked at it as well. But I think for us, it was just a lack of support of functions. I'm not a dev engineer sort of thing, so we've got our team, but we were evaluating all the stream options out there, including the new vendors as well. And every time we looked at it, we went, it's lacking some features. It's lacking the ability to offload the data better. It's lacking scalability features and so on. And it might be that Flink isn't the best solution, but it's widely adopted. It's got a lot of support. These things do break and you need to try and fix it. And, you want a good community at least behind it, I think. So, as far as I know, there was a lack of development in KSQL also. It seemed like Confluent wasn't behind it properly, at least the discussions we had internally. And while, as I mentioned earlier, we were reluctant to look at Flink initially because we kept hearing everyone moaning about how difficult it was to manage. It does add challenges, but it can do anything. And it just works so well that I think this is why everyone's got behind it. I think partly also Flink has a chance to replace Kafka, right? Because you can do CDC pipelines, or at least let's say pipelines, without Kafka, and that seems attractive to people. But again, I think it seems attractive to people that want to try and build and keep it in-house. Because actually, if you're doing a managed service, you don't really care too much what's being used. But yeah, so we went with Flink just because it can do anything, and it does it very well. It's very mature. It's got a lot of community support. I just don't think we see that behind KSQL at all. I'm not sure what you think, but
yeah, no, I mean, my understanding is that Confluent has totally de-emphasized it, and so I don't see it going anywhere fast. And I mean, maybe part of the problem here is that SQL is a very simple and powerful language. It just refuses to die, right? Like people said during the HDFS era, like, oh, no one is going to write SQL in a few years. They'll just write MapReduce, which was kind of ridiculous. No one wants to write Apache Pig jobs to do basic data processing, but I think at some point, even though its simplicity becomes a problem, maybe ultimately that was part of the issue too, that when you start working with streams, you don't just need basic set theoretic mathematical concepts. You need things like windows and a bunch of different window types. Then you need to think about memory management. Maybe we were just pushing SQL a bit too far to do some of those things that you need to do in a real time environment.
Yeah, we've had customers coming in recently and they're using JavaScript and all sorts of stuff. And I've got this transform job. Can you help me? Like, okay. Yeah, we're not going to put that into SQL very easily, but let's have a chat. So,
okay, I want to bring up one of the big events in the streaming real-time database space that we were talking about before the show, which is the Roxet acquisition. And frankly, you know, obviously still all the attention is focused on AI, but I think for anyone working with a product or just aware of the startup data space, it sent out a lot of shockwaves. So maybe you can just talk about what happened and why people are so upset and madly hunting for other solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the high level, one thing that became very clear in the aftermath of that, I mean, Roxet gave their monthly customers in particular a pretty short window to replace. I guess maybe I should say OpenAI gave the Roxet customers a pretty short window to replace a database, which, you know, is a tough position to be in. And I think folks were really faced with you know, the fact that Roxet was very unique, right? So like if you were using MongoDB or DynamoDB, Roxet was really good at both integrating with and dealing with, you know, that sort of semi-structured data natively. And so it meant that like you could, I guess for lack of a better word, get away with, you know, a lot and effectively, you know, do a bunch of stuff with Roxet that you can't do that with any of the alternatives, right? And so what it meant was that, you know, a lot of folks were, I mean, there are other good real-time databases like ClickHouse, which has been what we've most frequently seen folks migrating to. But ClickHouse is very different from Roxet. And so you need an ETL tool in the middle. Like, so that's a lot of what we've been doing is helping folks get the data out of, you know, those semi-structured databases into ClickHouse. But there's also, you know, ClickHouse is much more, you know, strongly typed and, you know, SQL oriented, right? So it doesn't handle that, you know, deeply nested data in the same native way that Roxet did. And so there's been a lot of work associated with that. So anyway, that's maybe a little bit more of the details, but yeah, I think it introduces, you know, questions that folks have about like, you know, the database that they're relying on and making sure that it's going to be around, right? When they, you know, if things change in the future. So.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, to me, the whole reason you pay a premium to be on AWS is not just the reliability of instances and the fact that you can fail over to other zones, but the assumption that the service you rely on is going to be supported for a long, long time. And AWS is famous for like hardly ever deprecating anything. Once in a while they do, but even if they do, they give you a lot of notice. If I'm a founder and I'm adopting products, how does this change my relationship to startups? Do I reassess how I do business with startups now because of this event?
I mean, I think there were some of those questions that came up, and I think in principle, you know, open source, you know, it should I guess give people at least a feeling that they're protected on that, even if maybe in practice it's not actually the full like panacea that they might think it is. But that was definitely a question that was coming up. But I think in our experience, you know, at the end of the day, most people just wanted a solution to their problem. And, you know, I think it caused some pain, but, you know, I guess we didn't see a lot of people who were like, oh, for example, you know, streamkap is also, you know, a startup and yeah, I think we've got a good business and, you know, we're not too worried about it, but, you know, it's obviously a question that people, you know, had coming out of that was like, you know, you guys going to be around. And, you know, I think we've been able to assure folks that, you know, we have a long-term vision and a good business. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, like it didn't dramatically change things in terms of how folks were looking at the market. I think Roxet was just particularly unique in the sense that there really weren't any alternatives on the market, right? And I don't actually really see that kind of dynamic quite the same way in other categories of the market, right? Like if you look at, you know, ClickHouse, like there are, you know, alternatives to it that behave in a similar way. It's just, you know, if you were somebody who was, you know, running your application on MongoDB or DynamoDB, Roxet was a really easy choice. And, you know, it's not clear how big that market was, but they were a really good option for that, right? And so they were kind of in a unique space where, you know, it's not that often. You hear a lot of like startup CEOs who say like, yeah, we're the only one who does this thing. And I think actually Roxet was actually the only company that did that thing. And that's actually pretty unusual, right? That you have a truly unique offering.
Yeah, I didn't realize how, I mean, I knew they were doing well, as in, you know, everyone knew of Roxet and we had customers using Roxet. But I didn't know there was just so many on it. And I didn't know they're all using DynamoDB. So it was just like, God, there's so many. So it just, it came out after, it's pretty clear. Lots of people on DynamoDB were heading to Roxet, and it's created a good opportunity for the market in general, but yeah, very unfortunate for them. And then realizing there's just nothing really compatible. There are similar companies, I can't remember the names, but there were similar companies that popped up saying, oh, we are exactly like Roxet. But every prospect we spoke to who tried them said no. And that might not be the case, of course, for others, but they were just like, we tried it, but it wasn't as mature as Roxet. And we've decided to bite the bullet and transform our data and get it into, a ClickHouse or a Snowflake, for example, instead. So it's quite interesting.
Is this an opportunity for some other company, like either an existing company to expand their product to grab that market, or someone to found a new company? Or on the other hand, is it just not going to happen because of the funding situation?
I mean, I think, yeah, maybe it's probably more an opportunity for existing companies to go and, like Click. I mean, ClickHouse, I think, has been the biggest beneficiary. Tinybird as well, also built on ClickHouse though. So as a technology, let's say ClickHouse has definitely been the big, sort of winner out of that shift. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. I don't. It's not clear to me that there's. I mean, there are other sort of earlier stage, like open source products that are. I know. I think we've heard from folks do a good job, but we haven't actually seen it in practice. So it'll be interesting to see, what happens there. But as you say, right, like, I think the classic adage is, it costs $100 million to build a database, and if you look at some of the companies that were founded in the sort of real-time space, they've all raised at least that much. And yeah, the funding environment, as you say, is very different from what it was a couple of years ago. So I think it would be difficult probably for a new entrant to go and say, hey, I need to raise $100 million to go do this thing. And, for what has been, I think it was probably a decent exit for the Roxet folks, for the investors, but not a huge outcome, right? Where, it's an obvious market to go after in that sense. So probably.
Yeah. I mean, they did a good job, right? I mean, it's not a cheap problem to solve at all. So I just can't imagine a new vendor come along, as you say, raising loads of money and then going, oh yeah, we're just like Roxet, which, sold out and all the customers went to ClickHouse and whatever else. So, but I mean, yeah, it's clearly not a cheap problem to solve. And even with the beneficiaries of this technology, like ClickHouse, they're trying to rapidly develop now to help handle those, those use cases that Roxet provided for. And it's not a fast solution, even with their backing, if that makes sense. And to the point that we have to transform the data before it goes in and so on. So very difficult problem to solve, I think.
Yeah. So maybe it's one of those problems that will be solved someday, where 20 years from now, people will look back and say, we've solved this problem, and someone solved it 20 years ago, and then the solution just disappeared from the face of the web.
I imagine ClickHouse and, BigQuery and others will just get better and faster at doing this. And that's what's going to happen now, rather than a new vendor come through. And like I said, sorry, there are vendors out there, but we didn't hear anything. We spoke to a lot of prospects straight away, because we were working also with Roxet about helping them find a new home. And I'm not aware anyway, personally, that any of them went with these new other vendors. So I think it's going to be very hard to compete.
Yeah. I think what we saw was people are using some version of ClickHouse, or in some cases, Postgres, actually, for use cases.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so let's talk about that. I mean, there's been a lot of talk in the air about the Postgres renaissance, and you have a bunch of companies founded around Postgres. I've heard Wes McKinney, very famous for Pandas, and frankly, a bunch of other stuff, talking about Postgres. What is driving that renaissance? Like, why are we looping back to technology that frankly used to be kind of viewed as old and stodgy and very useful? It was like a wrench, you always need a wrench, but it's not very sexy or exciting. What happened with Postgres?
I think this falls down to me to answer, but I don't have the answer either. So I'm a bit like you. I was a bit baffled. I was like, how come Postgres is getting so popular? But there's definitely it's the same thing, right? There's a massive community backing, and it's kind of like, it's Kafka, it's Flink, it's Postgres. These sort of technologies are suddenly coming through more and more. So I'm not sure of the reason. Clearly, it's just capability and turning it serverless and scalable and so on. But yeah, nearly every prospect that comes in has Postgres as well. It's quite interesting. So, I mean, I've kept an eye on some of the serverless, like Neon and everything else. and it all looks good and useful. But why it was Postgres over everything else, I'm not entirely sure. But I think it's just it does scale very well.
Yeah, it does seem like there's a dimension of like it relates to the community support and the scale of adoption. There's just a big you see a lot of extension based improvements to or extensions of Postgres that seem to be part of that, right? So if you're the standard, then you're what everybody builds around, and if you can extend on it to do other things, that seems to be part of what's helping to bring Postgres back to the fore is the extensibility into other use cases with analytics or time series or what have you, right? There's a bunch of different you've got different applications, and now you have options to use Postgres for those things, right? So.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, doing consulting and working with startups and big companies, you would just see Postgres everywhere, again, like a wrench, right? It's just this old tool that everyone used. And at least part of my interpretation was that things like the JSON B type got much, much better over time. And so they started to be able to replace or at least compete with Mongo. And so it's like they covered more and more surface area with this really well-supported tool. But it's just fascinating to watch, though, because I would not have expected this like 2 years ago that Postgres would be.
No, agree. And actually, we had a batch ETL company before this, and no one was really sending data to Postgres. Now, people sign up, they go, oh yeah, I want it in Snowflake, I want it in ClickHouse, and I want it in Postgres. so there's all sorts of places to send it to. And we've got customers that are sharing data, right? So I say in the vendor then is releasing their own data out to their own customers. Yeah. And they're like, okay, so you'd assume they want to put that into their customers' Snowflake or something. And they're like, no, quite a lot of them are actually using Postgres as their reporting tool as well. So it's definitely more widely spread than we first thought as well.
That's it. Are you seeing, I need to research this myself, frankly. I haven't kept up on this.
Yeah.
Is Postgres columnar taking off? Because that was always one of the issues, right? Like Postgres columnar has existed for a long time. Cluster solutions, multi-node have existed for a long time, but people didn't really use them. It was mostly just traditional relational, DB engine or whatever. And that's where you would lose the performance for these analytics queries.
It's not something I'm aware of or seen. I mean, we get told, we get basically just said, oh, I want to send it to Postgres, and they connect Postgres. So I'm not really familiar with that. And from that point of view, I was an Oracle DBA at one point, and so I understand databases in general. But literally, my knowledge of how Postgres is being used these days is our customers saying to us, we want to send it more and more to Postgres, which is just surprising initially. Like I said, I think people are centering around Postgres, Kafka, Flink, Iceberg, and that's going to be the stack.
I think part of that is that it's another nuance of this Roxet fallout was that Roxet had pretty diverse use cases and different types of indexing. And so I think the places where we've seen in that context, basically somebody might be using ClickHouse for the analytical side of things, and then Postgres for some of the things they had been using Roxet for that that are not so much analytical, list building, things like that. So I think it's slightly a fallout from Roxet being a very supporting a diverse set of use cases, let's say. So
that's very interesting. I mean, it seems like there was this movement almost 20 years ago to say, we shouldn't all be using the same database for every possible application. You need to use the right database for the right application. And yet here we are back in 2024, like, well, Roxet didn't work out. Let's just go back to Postgres.
It's a bit weird because I was going to say, you must remember, I mean, if we go back to when we talk about like Redshift, right? Like Redshift is built on Postgres. And so Postgres was around because it was the best database to kind of turn into a data warehouse, but it wasn't great. Redshift came along and hacked it together, and it worked pretty well, but really bad at concurrency, but actually amazing at doing the queries. So I just think it's probably just matured more. People already had Postgres in place. So
makes sense. Although Redshift takes us back to that Postgres columnar thing. I said it wasn't widely used. Actually, that's the exception, right? Redshift is the main flavor of Postgres columnar, where I was aware of it being widely used. Maybe that's not true anymore. Maybe there are a lot of other columnar deployments happening.
I mean, the Redshift team put a lot of money into that.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
I mean, we were speaking to them when they were trying to compete with Snowflake, and they were just losing business every single day. And it was just amazingly fast at complex queries, but the concurrency problem just was killing it. I think if they had the concurrency problem resolved back then Snowflake wouldn't have taken so much business. It just couldn't cope with multiple queries.
Yeah, and I guess my interpretation of it, having worked a lot with like Snowflake, BigQuery, and Redshift some, is that initially a lot of what sold Redshift was just the simplicity of deployment. Like it was just point and click, and you could have a database in maybe a few minutes, and you could run one node, and it would be really, really cheap. And then Snowflake came along and they're like, well, yeah, we can do all that, but also your data is now stored in object storage. And so you don't need persistent nodes anymore. And Redshift kept trying to add features to keep up, but it's still complicated, right? It's like, well, you can store data in object storage, but you need a special node type and sharing is hard. And so I don't know. To me, it's a lot of it. This is something that Jordan Tagani said a while ago about BigQuery. Actually, he's like, the Google team developed BigQuery, and we thought it was a great solution because it could scale to petabytes of data. But it turned out that what people really wanted was easy query, right? Like you just go to the console and type a query. And I think that's where Redshift kind of lost its way. Like it became not the simplest solution to use anymore.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think it's because it needed tuning on the concurrency. What was the Snowflake's first, I'll say not first CEO, the previous CEO called? I can't remember his name. Anyway,
Frank Zluman, or the one before, or before
the one
that?
Before that, yeah.
Oh, I'm not remembering either.
But I met him, and my previous business was I think one of the first 5 customers of Snowflake in the UK. So this is like back quite a long time ago. And I met him, and he said, "Oh, why are you looking at Snowflake?" Because we'd already been on Spark, Redshift, we tried everything. It's like, concurrency. He's like, "Yeah, we hear it from everyone. It's concurrency." So the simplicity was one spec, but Redshift was pretty simple. In fact, if you were one user, run a query, it was like lightning fast. And the indexing you had to apply wasn't that bad, and you could run some scripts and just typical indexing, tuning of the indexes. So yes, it was a bit more manual, but it wasn't that bad. And Snowflake did improve upon that, but the concurrency was just a nightmare. 5, 10, 15 concurrent queries, and what took 5 seconds is now taking a minute. They just didn't. It just took them like a decade to improve upon it to a level that Snowflake can do, and they still haven't really got it. So I think missed opportunity, but clearly worked well for Snowflake.
It's just crazy to watch in this space how quickly things change. Like something can become really exciting and go to old news within like 2 years. It happens all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is good news if you founded a company. So hopefully that effect is going to benefit you quite a bit. I mean, right? That's exactly where you want to be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm gonna post one of our comments here from one of the people participating here. So this is from Shashank Kumar. With AI rapidly evolving, how do you see the future of data engineering? What key tools and technologies should data engineers focus on to stay relevant and effectively complement AI advancements? And then we get this flavor of question all the time, but I'm curious to hear your take, because obviously you both bring a unique perspective to the table here.
Paul, do you have an answer or a view, or if I'll give it a
go? Go for it.
Yeah, it's quite broad, and I'm not an AI engineer, but at least from our point of view, we have got use cases in streaming pipelines where we're helping kind of LLM type companies or getting that data into the right shape. And so one of our customers is an e-commerce company, one of the largest fashion brands in Europe. And we're grabbing data and taking a stream from what's called Rudderstack, so live event stream of event data, coupled then with another stream of their MySQL CRM data, let's call it, or the e-commerce store data, transforming that data using Flink into a certain shape and joining up the data, and then sending that data out to a third party called Superlinked, which is then helping, in effect, create models for real-time recommendation engines. So at least in that use case, Flink is super useful for getting data in shape before you can do something with it. You can't just send it to a database and expect to build recommendation engines. You have to do something with it, right? So that's definitely one case we've seen. We've seen others. We've got other customers that do labeling and feature engineering for LLM type and Gen AI type use cases also. In those scenarios, we're streaming across, and again, Flink is really useful again. So I think real-time streaming, real-time processing in particular. We can see it with our customers, but also it makes sense, right? Like get that data in shape in real time rather than a batch load and then serve it up to customers, slow in effect. So it's probably the number one I think you can think about and focus on is probably something like Flink and stream processing.
Yeah, I think there's probably two layers of that question, really, in a way. Like one is like how can data engineering work support AI, right? And I think that's a critical aspect. So I think Ricky, you touched on some of that there, because obviously, there's a huge opportunity for folks in data as AI becomes, more prevalent. That you're working on the infrastructure that supports it, right? Ultimately, so and then I don't have a good answer for this, but then there's a separate question of like, as a data engineer, what AI tools should you be using to make to be more effective at your job? So I don't know if you have a perspective on that, Ricky, but like I think one dimension is like, okay, where are the areas where you're seeing the practical applications? One comment I'll make about that first point is, I think there's obviously in the last couple of years a ton of buzz about AI, a huge amount of money going into it, and I think the first version of this is, I was talking to somebody the other day who, sort of secondhand contact, I guess, for someone at OpenAI, and I guess one of the challenges they have is that they're trying to get customers who actually have real use cases. There's a lot of people who want to come and spend millions of dollars with them, but part of that is just, we saw that a lot earlier this year with companies getting hit on after their earnings calls when they didn't appear to have an AI strategy, right? And so there's a lot of money that's going out, to vendors like OpenAI, just so that a company can say on their next earning call, hey, we've got a strategy, we're spending much money with OpenAI, but that they don't necessarily have a real application, right? And they, I think you see it. Companies are caught in between a little bit. I think of like Air Canada or even Google themselves, right, have had some very public gaffes associated with the lack of maturity in this stuff. And so on the one hand, there's a ton of pressure from like the markets that you need to have an OpenAI strategy. On the other hand, you're seeing Google, arguably the leader, like not get it right. And so you have like, okay, like how do we get to something that's actually going to be useful for the business and make sense? And like the use cases that Ricky was describing, like these are places where we've actually seen very material business impact for customers. So I think we definitely believe that there is a lot of value to be had here, but I think there's still a big gap between the buzz and consistently figuring out like where this is going to be valuable for folks. So I think there's a lot of change, right? Like I saw a comment I think over the weekend that like Mark Zuckerberg had made some comments about NVIDIA, right, and their investments into AI infrastructure, and it's like either things are gonna tangent off and we're gonna stop seeing improvements with increased spend, or we're not, right? And those are like the bull and bear cases for sort of NVIDIA and for AI in general, right? Like we might see several more years of heavy investment and continually improving models, in which case things are going to change really rapidly, or we might see things start to converge at a certain level, and it's hard to say what that's going to look like. Our strategy on this has really been to focus more on where are people seeing a practical advantage rather than just sort of slap AI on something and just say we do it, I guess. But so I don't really have a strong perspective on the sort of practical side of things in terms of like tools for data engineers to use necessarily. But I think that's a little bit what we're seeing in the market in general.
That's interesting. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think it must be like 10 years already now. Everyone's trying to chuck in an AI story, right? Every SaaS startup is like, oh, we're AI, and you find out it's just a human clicking a button. So, I mean, I think that is overhyped. There's a lot of nonsense to it all. But clearly we're getting some massive, progress. But it's the same story, right? Everyone's trying to add on the AI angle to their business. But anyway, from a data engineering point of view, I think prepping the data is still key. None of this data is of much use whatsoever. Chucking it into a Redis database and so on. You have to do much more with it. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I will say too, I'm on the record saying I've given a couple of talks about this, that some of these classical approaches in data engineering are probably going to make a comeback. So in other words, a couple of specific things I have in mind. Right now, the approach at OpenAI or Google is to just like scan everything, including the darkest corners of Reddit or whatever you can find, and shove it into the model. And I don't think that's going to happen forever. I think we're going to see eventually more data pre-processing, because otherwise we're not going to be able to fully solve problems like hate speech and misinformation, a lot of other things. The other place where I see an opportunity for data engineers that will emerge in the future is starting to emerge already, is more classical methods. Now, when I say classical in tech, that means like 5 years old, right? But things like classical NLP, so in other words, statistics-based NLP. Why would that be the case when you have this incredible technology? Well, as we were discussing before the show, the current estimates for the cost of an chat GPT query range between 30 and 70 cents average, and that is a lot of money. And so if you can save a huge amount of money by using more classical methods that data engineers have to code, then that's probably going to happen eventually for specialized applications. Like a company I'm aware of is called Jon Snow Analytics. Jon Snow here is not the Game of Thrones character, but he's a scientist who discovered that cholera goes into groundwater, and that's how it was transmitted. And so their thing is like analyze medical records, try to extract research results by analyzing medical records. But to do that just with large language models is very, very expensive. And so they mix methods, and I think we'll see more of that. And I imagine that's going to affect you quite a bit too, right? Like some of these streaming problems that you're trying to solve, yes, you can feed data into a large language model, but maybe a classical NLP approach will be much more cost effective and accomplish what you need to accomplish. Speaking of which, like, do you see any like kind of statistical NLP methods appearing in real-time systems? Is that a thing that you can do in Flink or some other approach?
We haven't seen it at all. No, it's not so. And I haven't. Unless you come across anything, but I haven't. No, but I think your point comes back down to it's the same as the whole Roxet issue, right? Like you can send that JSON data into a standard, not say standard, but a Snowflake. You can process it. It'll just cost more money. There's no issue with it. It can handle it, as well. But it's the same thing. So ChatGPT is useful and maybe expensive, but they can afford it. But pre-processing and that's just got to get more and more. It's got to become more focused for everyone. Not only we get better results, it'll become cheaper also, I think. And because the thing is, once it's in the LLM, there's not actually that much you can do with it. So as in, once the model is built, there's only so much tuning usually you can do around the model. So the better the quality of the data in, the better out. So.
Yeah, and actually that's another like our understanding to a certain extent of why OpenAI bought Roxet was for that type of reason, right? So that like
I'm sure,
internal application actually is to better get more customers enterprise data in to do better pre-processing, better getting better quality output from models.
That's interesting, and I'd be curious to know. Obviously, we don't have a view inside inside OpenAI, but I'd be curious to know if the engineers they hired out of Roxet are also helping with just the basic scraping and like pre-processing of data for model training, because that is such a massive undertaking.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, as soon as I heard that the sale was done, I thought, is OpenAI going to open up saying we can now ingest your data into Roxet in effect? So because it will help enterprises offer AI solutions also, of course. But I think all the databases are working with them, including ClickHouse, in reality. So I think that OpenAI still needs databases underneath. So I'm sure they've got a bit of everything, but as much whatever can help with the pre-processing, will be beneficial.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And that's, again, where I feel like data engineering right now, to be a data engineer is a bit challenging. There are a lot of layoffs and such, but you can preemptively develop some of those skills that I think will still be useful within a few years. I mean, maybe the robots are going to take over and do our jobs. Maybe that's coming and they'll found their own companies, but I hope that's not the case.
Yeah.
Where are you seeing the, where do you think the layoffs are coming from?
So that's interesting. I mean, part of it was, from my perspective, is just over hiring during COVID. I mean, all these companies that did, that provided services, consumer facing, like Netflix or Instagram, like just
Yeah.
hired, or even Google, right? They had enough exposure to the consumer market with their cloud that they were able to hire a lot of people. And then all of a sudden, the market started to contract a bit. For those services, there was a drop in Netflix subscriptions. There was maybe a drop in Instagram usage, a lot of other usage. And so I think, and then at that point, I think a lot of it was just led by maybe the financial side of the company saying, hey, we're kind of bleeding now, or our numbers aren't as good as they could be. Do we really need this many people? And then also you have just the funding cycle on the startup side, where companies are no longer willing to like burn, huge amounts of money on the modern data stacks. Like, whoa, this is costing us a lot of money. Or when are we going to be able to raise another round? We have no idea. The financial situation is very, very uncertain. So let's cut some people. Yeah. I don't know. What are you seeing on your side? You've probably seen this phenomenon as well.
I think so. I think, when we're employing, right? So we're hiring data engineers, but we're not massive scale. But I mean, what we're okay. We just announced the funding, but there's definitely been a massive drop in the market in the last few years. So it can only have a massive impact on everyone's careers and jobs and so on. So
yeah, I think the short answer is sort of ZIRP era, both funding as well as just general spending for even large enterprises. And I think it's sort of more, I think there's still kind of in a return to normal, whatever that is, from that, and figuring out what the right size of these teams is and what makes it financial sense. So that's kind of what we're seeing. So
yeah. So speaking of which, one of the topics in our show notes, and one of the things that we plan to maybe discuss, was acquisitions and mergers, especially in the startup space. So what do you think about that right now? I mean, my interpretation of what happened during COVID is you had the Snowflake IPO in September 2020. As far as I know, it was the biggest tech IPO ever. Is that right? It was pretty big. And so then all this money started flowing into kind of traditional data type batch processing companies, which we call the modern data stack. And now a lot of that is contracted. And I think some companies are still doing very well out of that, and some are struggling financially, like Roxet kind of was at one point. So, but yeah, tell me more. I mean, what do you think about that topic? What are we going to see happening to data startups within the next, say, 2 years?
Paul, you want to try?
Sure. So, I mean, I think one outcome of that ZIRP era funding was that you had a lot of large rounds, much larger for a given stage than you might have seen before, because there was a lot of flow of money into that space. And so that meant that more companies were created than maybe would otherwise have been created, and they got more money than they would have otherwise gotten. And so I think this year probably we're starting to see the effect of people running through that money, and then like that's sort of when the tide's going out, and so we'll see like which are the real businesses that actually have a sustainable business model, and which are the ones that are just not a good business, or maybe should be a feature in another business. And so I think we'll see that more we'll continue to see that, let's say, in the next, particularly the next year or so. I would say is companies are either running out of money, or even if they've still got money, they're sort of been at it for 4 years, and if it's not working, like founders, employees get tired, right, and realize they just need to cut bait basically and move on. So I don't know, my sense is we're kind of coming to the end of that period, and the sort of the tail of cash that people had associated with that, and now, like, if you look at what it takes to get funded, I think that we've returned to a much more sensible approach to things, and looking at what are actually good businesses, and those are the businesses that are getting funded today. So I think the net result of that is you'll see acqui-hires and things like that for businesses that are not really working. And I don't know, I think the general acquisition market has been kind of strange, right? Like, I think there's sort of a subclass in the AI space where there these weird acqui-hires where they're sort of artificially large, and I think mostly kind of like the big players trying to get around, FTC regulation and things like that. And then, in the more traditional, like non-AI space, I think more traditional acquihires and just, some rolling up of things, right? And in the absence of all that cash, like, I think it makes sense not to have so many tools partly as well, right? Like there are a lot of things that don't deserve, that might be a good product, but don't deserve to be in a standalone company. And I think we'll see some more consolidation along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. 2 businesses ago, we raised nearly 10 million, and so fairly familiar with kind of how the funding landscape goes. And I think, as Paul mentioned, I mean, as we know, like 2-3 years ago, there was just so much money around. I think 2021 to 2022 was like hit like peak valuation, insane valuations. $1 billion valuations for companies that had a 1 million in revenue. There's no point naming names, but it's so ridiculous. It's not ridiculous if they turn into a great business and get the valuation up, of course, but and we don't know all the terms. But I think there's a lot of companies, as Paul said, they've raised a lot. It's a massive pref stack for those founders. So hopefully they took some money off the table at the same time, and and help themselves and get good salaries and so on. And you've still built a good business, right? Potentially, as in you've employed lots of people, but there gets a point, and it might be in the next year, 2 years, but that money will start to run out. And I can't imagine it's anything other than a down round, a restructure of the cap table, the pref stack, or an exit. And so, I think, as we've seen with some of the SaaS tools, prices started going up in the last year, also, right? So, some data transformation tools, they suddenly started going, the price went from like $50 a month to suddenly 2,000. And so they all suddenly start to realize there isn't a free cash situation anymore. And we need to start running a proper business that gets to, break even or something like that. And I think new companies are actually thinking more like that. So when we were out raising funds recently, people were going, okay, but what's your goal? Is it a lifestyle business? Of course, it's not a lifestyle business. We're trying to raise several millions here. Like, yeah, but are you trying to build $1 billion business? Because all we keep hearing is everyone wants to get to break even. So, it's like these things don't tend to marry up together. I want to get to profit in the next round and then be worth a fortune for a VC. So I think that's the trouble for the VCs is, who do they invest in if people are trying to get to break even profit and not going for massive growth as well. So it's tricky, but I think there'll be a lot more companies being sold off, classed as a win, but there'll be acquihires for sure and down round type situations and pref stack conversations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what I'll be curious to watch with many of these companies is what type of merger or acquisition happens. And I have a few things in mind. So if you look at the history of IBM, obviously not the coolest company in 2024, but huge impact on the history of computing. They came about as a merger of a couple of different companies in the electromechanical computing space at the time, and became this just massive juggernaut. And so kind of this private equity deal that brings these pieces together, but doesn't just extract all this debt and such, but actually builds a very healthy company. Another example, Atlassian, they've had their problems with security and such, but they built up the company by just a lot of acquisitions into a huge platform. On the flip side, you have things like the Qubole acquisition, or maybe the Stitch acquisition, where these companies, Qubole once upon a time was a pretty formidable player in the space and a big competitor of Databricks. And I mean, now I don't know that the product really exists anymore. Stitch is kind of coasting and extracting money, but not doing a whole lot otherwise.
Yeah. Stitch is an interesting example where they did a fantastic job of sort of PLG and in ETL, and really dropped the ball after the acquisition. And you do see that, right? Like, acquisitions are hard. It is, I don't know exactly what the failure rates are, but it's high, right? And so I think that's a bit of an uphill battle, I guess, from the acquisition side. I think you have like I think this isn't such a big deal for small company acquisitions, but for larger acquisitions, there's a lot more regulatory scrutiny, and then there's less money available, right? Like, we're not in a free money market anymore. And so anyway, it goes a bit to what Ricky was saying, right? With the pref stacks, evaluations and stuff like that. I think you need, it's a bit like the housing market in a way. Like, you kind of, right now, things have been kind of locked up because you have people who have a perception of what the value of their house is, and that they have a low rate on their mortgage,
Right.
and then the new buyers are coming in having to pay a much higher rate, and you have this mismatch between the buyer and the and the seller there on what reality they're living in. And so I think you need a bit of a forcing function on that, which in the startup market, I think is going to be just people running out of money, where you start to if you've got to go to market and you got to sell for market price, then that's going to determine what your company is worth. But if you're in advance of that, and you still have this high valuation and a pref stack, that means you're not going to get a lot of money. If you sell below that, then you're not very incentivized to sell if you don't have to.
Well, and it's funny too, because there was so much money sloshing around in 2021 and 2022 that these companies were extremely flush with cash. And I imagine some of them, if they were very aggressive about layoffs and cost management, could coast for years. I mean, yes, the burn rate at the time, they probably had 2 or 3 years, but if they cut back, they might have 5 or 10 years. And in that time, maybe you could actually build a real company or merge with other companies and create a real platform of tools, which is more interesting, I think.
Well, there's a mismatch, isn't there, between the VC and the investor and the company. That's the problem. You're always under pressure to grow faster. They don't want return 15 years later. They will take it, of course, but they want you to try and grow as fast as possible. And I think I'm pro investment in general, but there's lots of good businesses that would be around and survived if it wasn't for being rushed to spend the VC money. And you have to just find that right balance. But from what I can see, there's still a bunch of companies spending probably too much, and they're going to run out. Because you can just do basic math and realize how many millions of the 10 or 20 they've raised is going, and then you hear that they're not doing that well. So probably time to think about it. But yeah, anyway, I might be completely wrong. It might be amazing.
I don't know. I think that you're usually not. I mean, you have a good chance of being right by being pessimistic. Let's just say that in general. We'll see.
I mean, like I said, I've raised money, so I'm pessimistic on the basis that whatever you hear on the market is probably not the truth. So you can downgrade it a bit. But yeah, no. I mean, it's going to be interesting. I think some people are going to pick up some great technologies, and I think that's what OpenAI have done with Roxet. They probably, relatively, they picked it up for probably a bargain for how much effort has been put into it, and a ready-made product. So I think that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think, again, there's an opportunity for investors who really have a vision. Again, not the traditional, just borrow as much money as possible against the valuation of the company, but build a real platform for that type of private equity play. And I imagine some big player will come out of this era where someone takes 5 different companies, merges them, and actually builds a really good, successful platform, and even maybe, their own cloud or something crazy like this. So.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, there's some great technologies out there, regardless of the investment amounts.
Yeah. And just if you make it easier for those to play together, you're going to build a really good customer base, and people will pay a lot of money for simple integration. That's the reality.
Yeah. I mean, that does seem to be another trend, kind of relating a little bit to the modern data stack, is there's a lot of good functionality that exists there, but people don't want it in 6 different vendors, right? I think there's definitely a move back more towards I mean, you see it certainly with, I think Databricks has probably been the most direct about it in their announcements at their, in their event this year. Is, that clearly their push is that you can do everything in Databricks, right? And that's what I think we're a bit, I think, for putting aside some of the dynamics of the investment market, what have you, the customer, I think, is becoming, frustrated a little bit with that. Proliferation of tools, and while they might appreciate the functionality, they don't necessarily want to be dealing with so many vendors. So I think there's a drive from that side of things as well.
Well, it's probably driven by the staff layoffs. So
right,
it's probably we need to find a tool that's simpler and all in one. So that might also be part of it, right? It's probably why there's more managed services being deployed, I think, now as well. So as to the point earlier, if staff are being laid off, then what other choices do you have?
Well, and really basic things like how many contracts does legal have to review to build your data stack? That people don't realize how big a problem that is at an enterprise or even a small company, or how many different bills is the CFO going to see coming across their desk, even if they're not that large. So why are we paying 10 different companies just for this stack? This makes no sense.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the end of the hour here. It was really great to have you on. And any last thing you want to say in the last 2 minutes here or so to close it out?
Paul?
Okay, yeah, it's been great. Appreciate you having us on. And yeah, if folks are interested in streaming, we that's what we do at streamkap to make it easy to get data into Snowflake or ClickHouse, what have you. So feel free to reach out to us if you've got streaming questions.
Yeah, no, I'm rooting for streamkap. Exciting what you guys are doing. I am excited to see this broader move toward the simplification of streaming, and so I think you have a bright future ahead.
Great, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and enjoy the rest of the week.
And you.
Thank you.